Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NERC's webinar, Should Munis get back in the MRF game? I'm delighted to have you all with us today, and I would like to thank our gold sponsors for today's webinar, who are Advanced Drainage Systems and Vanguard Renewables. The webinar will be recorded. We welcome your questions throughout the webinar, and the way we will be taking questions is through the chat box. And for those of you that aren't so familiar with Zoom, you would look on the, it's like a black banner that shows up either at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen, and you want to look for the word chat. And then once you find that chat, you click on that, and a box will open, and there's a place where it says your question here, and just hit enter and your question will appear. And we suggest that you send your question to everyone. You'll see a little drop down box there. I'll bring my cursor there right now if I am able to. There we go. Right here, there's a drop down menu, and we ask that your questions go to everyone. Okay. I am delighted to have you all with us and to have our presenters, because collectively they have 89 years of experience working with MRFs. We have Mitch Kessler, President of Kessler Consulting, Sarah Reeves, Executive Director of Chittenden Solid Waste District, Rick Watson, Chief Executive Officer of the Delaware Solid Waste Authority. We also have Bethany Jewell of Kessler Consulting, and Bethany is providing us with the behind the scenes tech support. I would again like to encourage all of you to post your questions in the chat box. And I am going to allow Bethany to post Mitch's presentation, and we'll get started.
Marion, we're good to go?
We are good to go, Mitch.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. My job is to talk about the overview of what's happening with municipalities in the MRF game today, and does it make sense to consider getting back? So happy to be here. Sorry, the whole world has turned to video and webinars. I'm still an old school guy, but this is the world we live in right now. So my firm has over 32 years of experience doing solid waste planning and implementation and operation. I say that because much of that work has involved recycling processing. We have offices in Maine, North Carolina, Colorado. My main office is in Florida, where I am. As Marianne mentioned, we have some great experience here. I've been in the field for 38 years. Since this is a NERC presentation, I'm proud to say I was born and raised in the Northeast. I thank Marianne for inviting me to this. I went to law school in Vermont and New Hampshire, and I've lived in 4 Northeast states in my life. So I'm a proud Northeasterner and very happy to be on this. So next one, Bethany. So I'm gonna start with talking about, again, the basics and an overview. And really what I want to start with is, what is a MRF? Because there's I imagine, Marianne, I think you said there's well over 100 people on this, and people have a different level of knowledge. So a MRF is a material recovery facility. And if you think that tells you what it is, that's where the trouble starts, because in different states and different locations, they have different both statutory definitions. In New Jersey, for instance, it's an immediate processing facility. In Florida, a MRF is actually a mixed waste processing facility. But basically, what we're talking about today is commonly called a MRF, and that MRF sorts post-consumer recyclables back into saleable products. That's what we're trying to do. It doesn't matter if it's dual stream or single stream. So at least we're all talking about the same thing, except this photo is really illustrating. Here's two MRFs that are both in operation today. One is more of a state-of-the-art modern facility with millions of dollars worth of equipment, and the other is a series of conveyor belts in an older facility. So there's a tremendous difference in what a MRF is, and that's really one of the points for today. Well, these facilities vary greatly, both by technology, what materials are processed. Importantly for today is who owns and operates these facilities. So what I'm going to specifically talk about is when I say who owns and operates, who owns and operates, who owns the site, who owns the building, who owns the equipment. Sarah and Rick are later going to give their specific examples about that. And then, as important as anything, who operates the facility and who markets those materials. So we'll come back to those 5 factors. The bottom line to, I think, the whole day is what's your objective and what's the right fit for you, and that's today's topic. Next one, Bethany. So the question is, should municipalities get back in the game? And our little illustration here is one size fits all. Notice there's a sale. I would change the word to going out of business. Because in this business of recycling processing, one size does not fit all, never has and never will. The real answer as a consultant for 36 years is it depends. It depends on the community's needs and objectives. They're all not the same. MRFs aren't the same. The operators are not the same. One size does not fit all. And I think that's what we just need to keep in mind as we go forward on this today. It's not a one size fit all glove. Next one, Bethany. So that's easy to say, one size doesn't fit all, but why? And what does it mean? And these are some of the many, many variables that are out there. And it's different in Sarah's program, it's different in Rick's program, it's different than your program. If you own a MRF, if you operate a MRF, if you're looking to contract for a MRF, these are some of the many variables that are out there. I want to talk about a few of them briefly, because that's how you're going to decide what's right for your jurisdiction. The size of your community, be it your community or a region, critical. The demographics, your current program history, the financial implications, policy and politics. There's no government MRF that has ever been built, I'm going to say in the world, but certainly in the United States, that did not involve a political champion, politics, and someone driving that to occur. So that's critically important. Then business and contract options. And I'd lastly say, most importantly, probably program objectives of your program, what works for you, what you need. So many variables that distinguish the programs. You're going to see a distinction between Rick and Sarah's program as we do today. Next one, Bethany. All right, so here we have a slide for those of you who I've had an opportunity to meet before or present with before. This is a slide I commonly use because I think we forget to deliver the message in our industry that all services have a cost. Nothing has changed. Nothing to do with markets, nothing to do with anything has changed. It has always cost money to collect recyclables. It has always cost money to process them. It has always cost money to market or dispose of the material that's left. That hasn't changed. The difference that's really changed is what's happened. It's become something that was a revenue both to the public and private sector and is now a cost to the public sector. And the adjustments that the private sector has had to make is increasing their costs to make the profit. And we'll talk a bit about that. So I wanted to just plant the seed. All services have a cost. They do now, they have in the past. Let's talk a little bit about the history of that. It was one of the things Marianne wanted to make sure that we covered today. Well, if you go back to the 1960s to the 1980s, I'm just going to call that a period. There's been a shift in the industry that's occurred over the last, let's call it 60 years. From 60 to 80, most programs were source separated programs where recyclables were separated by the public or at a facility into tin, aluminum, newspaper, etc., glass. It was segregated recyclables. That's what I'm going to call it for here. That was mainly driven by the public sector. Those tended to be public facilities at that time. A shift happened between the 80s and the next 20 years to 2000. And that's a lot of programs moved to dual stream. Generalization, these dates overlap. That move to dual stream created a need to separate recyclables, and processing centers were, so to speak, born. So paper used to come in one segment, cans, bottles, plastics in another segment. That material had to be separated out by the category of material. That was really more of a public and private sector involvement. There was some of each. I would say that's when it was split. The next 20 years is really, I think, the focus of what we're talking about today is 2000 to today, 2020, programs moved to single stream recycling. All material mixed together in a cart or bin. That was mainly been operated by the private sector. So that's the shift that's occurred, both in how programs looked and the duration they worked. And I'm sure Sarah and Ricky can address some of that. What's also happened, both from a government and private perspective, is I mentioned it's gone from a revenue generator for a community to a cost, and that is a critical shift. Some of the gaps that exist right now is on the private sector side. That shift, as the markets changed, had to be more done quickly and in a more assertive way, because the private sector has to deliver a quarterly profit, and they had a shorter adjustment time to make a change. On the public sector side of the facility, it's more long-term, stable programs. I would hold out that's the essence of why today many people feel we're out of sync. This balance is out of sync, and we'll talk a bit about that. So next slide, please, Bethany. And that's really what I'm calling the perspective here. It depends where you sit. My friend, the pigeon here, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, so we had a lot of pigeons around, so I've always cared for them. Depending where they sit, they're not picking up a lot of popcorn or peanuts from the top of this building, but they have quite an overview of things. Then when they're on the ground, they're on the MRF sorting line, picking up their peanut and finding what they want. The purpose of this is really that success is driven by understanding the other party's perspective. And that's where we talked earlier on a call that this is where there's going to be a contracting element of it that I'm hoping NERC moves to, which is doing something on contracts, because understanding that other perspective is critical. Well, who are the players? On the public sector side, we have cities, municipalities, counties, regions, states, all doing something either on a day-to-day level or on a broader policy level. Now, you might notice on my public sector side there, I deliberately left out the federal government. And in my biased opinion, that's because they've been on hibernation for the last 15 years. Not many people have driven their program on what the federal government has done or laid out in the MRF world in the last 15 years. So again, I'm going to say cities, counties, regions, states are all doing things. They're the players. On the private sector side, because we're looking at the municipalities get back into this or the government, we have integrated solid waste hauling companies. All of you on this call know who they are. The larger companies who do collection, they have landfills, they might have transfer stations, et cetera. So there's the integrated solid waste companies. Then there are people just in the hauling business. Then there are people just in the processing business of processing recyclables and MRFs. And then we have brokers who are in the business and end user mills who are in the business. So on the private side, it's a more complicated mix of who the players are. Understanding and knowing how they fit is critical. Understanding their perspective and their priorities is also critical. And again, I think there's an out of sync. If you ask people why this is probably so well attended, why there's other constant webinars now on MRFs and processing, is there's an out of sync that I'm hoping we can get back in sync with, and I'll talk a bit about that. The important question is how you as a government, because the focus of this is on the government today, fit in with these people in these different categories. So I'm going to talk a bit, next one, sorry, Bethany. Some of the operational and ownership options that I mentioned, because I think this is important in deciding how you fit into this. It's who owns and operates these different possibilities of ownership structure. So I'm saying that these 5 components make up the areas you have to look at and decide which of these you want to be involved in, which of these you want to have ownership in, or which of you want to relinquish ownership in, and it could be all or nothing. So the site, every facility needs to be on a site, every facility needs to be in a building, every facility needs equipment, every facility has to be operated, and every facility has to have someone marketing it. That's really where you have the options. And I'm going to talk about a few examples at the end of where that fits. So regardless, it still requires cooperation between the two parties. I say that because I don't think there's a government that has an aluminum smelting plant or a paper mill in the United States. So no matter what option you choose, there's a reason to work together in a partnership. You could limit it where you have the site, you have the building, you have the equipment, you operate it. You could even market the material, but somebody else has to be buying it and turning it back into a product. So I'm really hopeful that in years to come, we could be more transparent in these partnerships to turn them into a win-win situation, which requires some trust and rebuilding. It's something that I think has eroded over the last 5 years. Next one, Bethany. So I'm going to start with talking about some of that need to rebuild and go back to that. Now that we know the site building, equipment, operations, and marketing and material, and you have to decide where you fit in that, to what I'm going to call the average market value, which is something I think we're some of the first people who worked on this concept 2 decades ago to come up with a way to measure this. I think there are others who did also, but we were certainly pioneers in this for 2 reasons. Well, 2 things I want to mention, then I'll mention the 2 reasons. First of all, what this chart is really illustrating is in the last 10 years, the revenue has gone from $150 a mixed ton down to ballpark $50. You can see where these lines fit in. That major shift is the #1 issue. If material is worth $150 a ton today, I can only assure you one thing. This webinar would not be occurring. Life is good when it was $150 a ton. It's not so good at $50 a ton. So that is the root issue that's paramount to everything. I take a fairly straight position on what an average market value is. This is one of the things that's going to be talked about, how they're done differently, defined differently. I think there's 2 basic rules from the government perspective. 1, use index pricing. Some people will say, well, that's not fair in both sectors. That's not fair because that's not what it's really sold for. I would hold out, in my experience, that the government is not in the day-to-day business in most cases of marketing this material. There are some exceptions, but they tend to be larger jurisdictions. So by using index pricing, you could not, the government isn't in that business, so they shouldn't be involved in that, and it makes it neutral, in my opinion, and the private sector could adjust their costs based on how on or off they think that index pricing is. Second is use inbound tons. And I say, why use inbound tons? Because the only thing the government can control is what they deliver to the facility. What happens to it after that, if it's a private facility or even your facility, you can't change that. You can change what the homeowner and business does. So those are my 2 rules. And I'm showing those here because something we're about to talk about. If you go to the next one, Bethany, but remember the root issue is the change in value of that material. So this is taking what we just talked about and bringing it home to the practical level. I would hold out that all data is local, and anytime we start talking about this data nationally or even regionally, we're making generalizations. So I would say the key here is to know your neighbor, but understand and mind your own business first. So these 2 examples speak to that. So what I'd like to call your attention, I know it's a little bit small, but if you look on the table on the left, on my left side, I guess it's on everybody's left side, these are both data based on recent recycling composition studies. And for those who aren't familiar with it, Marion said there's a full range of experience here. That's where you take the material, you break it down in a statistically valid way, and you come up with percents of the composition of the weight of the deliverables for that community's inbound recyclables. That's what that column is, the far left column is. It's listing the categories of material. The next category is the composition percent, and the next category, using an index, is what the value of that material is according to the index. We could spend a month debating what someone's really getting, what that number is, but for the purpose of this, it doesn't matter. The last column is taking that percent of composition of your material times that average value and coming up with a commodity and average calculation, the average market value. In this case, it's $60.99 a ton.
Mitch, can I just tell you, you have 5 minutes left?
5 minutes, your clock's different than mine. Mine shows 10 minutes.
15 minutes have gone by.
It's 20.
That's right. You have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Still 15. Okay. Mary, we talked about 20 minutes each and a half hour. So, but you could adjust that as you see fit. So anyway, what this is really getting at is these 2 cities next to one another. One is saying it's $60 and one is saying it's almost $70. Why is there a difference? If you look at this close, you'll see one has 30% cardboard ballpark, one has 18% cardboard. One has a contamination rate of 29%, one has 19%. Happy to talk to you afterwards, since we're moving through this quickly, to explain how you could bring about any change you want in the average market value by changing a few assumptions. If you assume that glass is being disposed of, or contamination is being disposed of at not zero, but a negative number, you could change this tremendously. If you assume that you're not doing any sorted recycling paper, which is worth $47 a ton according to this, and it's all mixed paper, it's going to change this significantly. So I'll leave it at that. The data doesn't lie. It's how we agree on the terms and the definitions. Next one, Bethany, please. Happy to answer any questions on that later. Collaboration and partnership is really what I've mentioned is out of sync. Since we're not at the $125 a ton value, we are out of sync. I'm going to go quickly on this one because this could be a future contracting one. We need equitable partnerships with full disclosure. There'll be, a separate session might make sense, but the trust in this industry needs to be rebuilt, in my opinion. There's been erosion, webinar after webinar, session after session that I go to. If it's a government session, the people in the room generally have doubts and concerns about their colleagues on the private sector being clear and transparent with them. How do I know that? I've done 30 MRF contracts in the last 18 months. That's been the case with every one of them. All right. So Marianne asked me to chat a bit about, well, what could you do about all this? What could the public sector do to evaluate if they should get back in the business or not? And this crosses over between both sectors. So this is an example around the country of some jurisdictions that have done or are doing a feasibility study analysis to look at and understand the pros and cons of them getting either back in the business, out of the business, or adjusting their role. And all of them have taken a serious look at it, and all of them come to different conclusions. Some of the ones listed here are in the process of it. The purpose here was to show this is happening all over the country. It's not in the Southeast, not in the Northeast, it's everywhere. So feasibility studies and evaluations of pros and cons are very advantageous to understand how your community fits in to either more or less involvement in running a MRF. Next one, please, Bethany. Public MRF program, again, these are examples of jurisdictions that made a decision to be in the public business. As I mentioned before, with those 5 cornerstone: site, building, equipment, operations, and marketing, some do all, some do some part of that. So for instance, starting at the bottom up, since this is a New England presentation, Springfield, Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts decades ago decided to have a role in this and set the groundwork to have a public MRF. The Solid Waste Authority in Palm Beach County, to this day, built a MRF, has somebody operate it, but they market the materials. Deep involvement. Mecklenburg County, the same way. Those 3 programs are all over 30 years of major public involvement in some aspects of the 5 items I mentioned. They tend to control it in those 3 by owning the site, owning the building, etc. The 2 above that are more recent examples. Emerald Coast Utility Authority, which is the Panhandle of Florida, is about 2 years old. And they didn't start this way, but they now built the building, own everything, operate and market the material. And Charleston County is going through a shakedown this week and start up this week for a facility that is a $28 million facility with robots and everything else that they will own. They have somebody else operating and marketing. So to the public sector, there's lots of folks looking at this. Marianne asked for some examples of that. Next one, Bethany. I want to go back to what I call this disconnect, because I think we could change that. For those who've been in the industry for a long time, it's time for that disconnect to end. The data, contracts, and what people are saying says we're out of sync. Well, why are we out of sync? I think it's language and objectives. These 3 things continue to be confusing to people. And I'll close on this to say, if we understand these 3 key features, we'll be well on our way to stopping this disconnect. Why is there a disconnect? Well, if you start with the first one, processing costs. If you ask people processing costs, what that means and what it is around the country, I've heard numbers anywhere from $50 a ton to $150 a ton. Well, that's all based on their understanding and how they define what makes up that cost. It's different costs to different people. If you're an integrated solid waste company, if you're a small jurisdiction, your costs may or may not be different. It's who's paying for what. So we don't understand processing costs at the level we need to. Commodity value, same thing. We go back to those charts that I put up. I could adjust that so the commodity value could be $20, the commodity value could be $80. It depends on how you're selling, how you're processing those materials. Contamination rate, same thing. Count glass as contamination, I'm not suggesting that, or remove glass from your program, you're gonna have a very different number. Same with mixed plastics, same with mixed paper. Termination is the key. We need to find a common ground. We need to be as transparent as possible and rebuild the trust that's been eroded. Next one, Bethany, and you'll be happy, Marianne. I still have 4 minutes according to my clock, but this is our last slide. So I think I'm finishing ahead, hopefully leaving some more time for questions. So this is really about what's the government's path forward into getting back in the MRF business. And all I'm trying to illustrate here is there are multiple paths. There is no one right path. The key is working to evaluate and lead your policy makers to the best solution for the objective of that community. And I would hold out that every community is unique and different. And with that, I appreciate your time, Marianne. Unless there's something you want me to cover in the 2 minutes I have, I will yield to my colleagues from other states.
There are no clarifying questions, Mitch, so I would suggest let's move on to Sarah Reeves. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you, Marianne. And thank you, Bethany, for pulling up my, my presentation. While Bethany's doing that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Sarah Reeves, and I am the Executive Director for the Chittenden Solid Waste District, and we are located in Williston, Vermont. Our district is essentially the Chittenden County, so we are Burlington over 18 communities to the east. I also, before coming up to Vermont 4 years ago, I was the Director of Recycling Services for the Rhode Island Resource Recovery Corporation. Next slide, please, Bethany. Thank you. So I've worked with MRFs in 2 small states, Rhode Island being the smallest, obviously, and also a very densely populated urban area. Vermont is mostly rural, and I happen to be representing a county that is one of the urban centers, but is a very, very rural state. Rhode Island has just over 1 million folks who live there. Vermont has just about 630,000. So again, pretty small. And the differences are, we'll go through a little bit further down the slides, but the MRFs that we'll be focusing on, that I'm focusing on, there is only one in Rhode Island, and so that's the one I was responsible for overseeing. In Vermont, there are 2. The one that my organization owns is up in the northern part of the state, in the Burlington area. And there's another MRF that is in the southern part of the state, and that one is operated by Casella Waste Services. Next slide, please. So there are similarities between the 2 state programs. Both CSWD, Chittenden Solid Waste District, and Rhode Island Resource Recovery Corporation, RIRRC, are state chartered municipal entities. Both again are considered municipalities or instruments of the state. Both entities own the property. So that was one of the factors that Mitch talked about, was land. And do you have land available that you could dedicate to a facility? Both entities that I worked for do own the property that the MRFs stand on. And it depends on how much land you need. I will always say the more the better. You definitely don't want to find yourself squished, and that is one of the problems that we have at the MRF here in Vermont, the one that CSWD owns, is that it's on an extremely small footprint in a very small building and does not have any room for expansion. The one in Rhode Island, they built it years and years ago, so it was originally built by what was called New England CR Inc., New England CRINC at the time, and they purposefully co-located that facility with the corporation's landfill. So Resource Recovery Corporation in Rhode Island owns the state's only landfill, and they co-located the MRF there, which made a ton of sense. So they were able to build a nice large facility. That facility is approximately 75,000 square feet. The facility in Vermont that we run is about 32,000 square feet. Both the corporation and the district own the MRF assets, so they own the building. Resource Recovery bought that building from Waste Management, who had bought it from Crink, and then had been running it ever since. But we both own the buildings, and we both are responsible for the equipment and the rolling stock that are contained in the MRF. So both generate revenue from selling the sort of recyclables. That's pretty standard. Both were selling the recyclables. And again, I'm going to back up a little bit and say that my experience with Resource Recovery was from 2007 to 2016. So if there are differences now, please definitely reach out to Resource Recovery, but my experience is reflected in this presentation. We both did use a broker, and a key factor too is that both states had mandatory recycling. Rhode Island had mandatory recycling since 1987. Chittenden County, CSWD, had mandatory recycling since 1993. And the state of Vermont didn't have mandatory recycling until Act 148 was passed, which was in 2012. And then that phased in mandatory recycling over the next 3 years. And both Resource Recovery and CSWD have very, very strong education and outreach programs. Resource Recovery is a statewide entity. CSWD is just a county entity. Next slide, please. So some of the differences, and these are pretty significant. Again, in Rhode Island, it is just the one MRF for the entire state. There is no tip fee, and a tip fee, for those who may not be familiar, is the fee that haulers or cities or towns or users of that MRF will pay literally to tip their material out onto the sorting floor, onto the floor that gets where the material will be pushed up onto a conveyor belt and then to be sorted. So by statute in Rhode Island, that MRF is not allowed to charge a fee to municipalities. Resource Recovery owns and now currently operates. This is relatively recent in the past couple of years, where they also took over the operation of the facility. Prior to about 2 years ago, Resource Recovery used a third-party staffing company to operate the lines. And then they decided to fold everybody into the Resource Recovery personnel. The MRF employees, and this goes to with the previous point, are Resource Recovery employees. And that's a big deal when you're thinking about, can I afford to do this? Do you want to farm that sorting labor out? Do you have enough capacity in your municipal budget to add additional employees on with the benefits and et cetera, what else you may have? Rhode Island also has statutory flow control. And essentially flow control means that Resource Recovery is allowed by law to direct materials to their facility. And that's built into the law. It's a fairly controversial, in some circles, legal precedent, not necessarily Rhode Island's, because it is essentially a municipal MRF, and Rhode Island defines municipal as just material generated by residents in a city or town and in city or town buildings, and does not wrap in commercial to that definition. So they are able to flow that residential and school material to their MRF because the MRF was built with, is being operated by a public entity. In addition, they have the landfill, and some operations of the MRF are subsidized by that landfill revenue. So in Vermont, you can see some of the differences. We have the two MRFs, as I mentioned, one public, one private. Ours is the public one. We do charge a tip fee. Our tip fee is lower than the private MRF because as a municipality, we do not need to generate a profit. Again, we don't have shareholders. We just need to cover the costs and cover our capital investments. We do have a third-party operator by contract. Casella Waste Services is our operator. We also have a series of drop-off centers or small convenience centers, transfer stations, where people can drop off recyclables there at their convenience and then bring them, they get brought to our MRF. And we operate the MRF as an enterprise fund. It essentially needs to pay for itself. Next slide, please. So when we were looking, so we're actually looking at in CSWD at a new MRF. Our MRF was built in 1993-94, and it has all of the same technology that existed at that time, which is to say it has a magnet and it has some conveyor belts and people. So people do all of our sorting at our MRF. The MRF in Rhode Island is a very high-tech modern MRF, and I oversaw the transition from dual stream to single stream when we completely rebuilt that MRF. That was back in 2012, and it was a cost of $17 million back in 2012. So what we're looking at, and questions that you may want to ask yourselves are, again, are the state and local laws compatible? You know, do you have mandatory recycling? Is it something where people have to keep materials out of the landfill? Do you have that available property? We do. We have about 20 or so acres available to us, maybe a little bit more, that we're able to build a new facility on. And as I mentioned, our MRF currently is about 32,000 square feet. We think we need 60,000 square feet to do what we want to do. The 32,000 square foot MRF was built to accommodate 25,000 tons of material a year. And we're now sorting about 45,000 tons of material. So we're undersized. That speaks to the volume of material that you can expect and the type of materials. We all ran into the same difficulties when China was taking anything and everything. So we were just taking it all, and especially in Rhode Island where we had more of the equipment to be able to sort through. But now we're really looking hard at kind of the basic five and really focusing on materials that we know we can market. Again, and talking about staffing capacity. Do you want to run it in-house? Do you want to have a third-party operator? We're looking at funding capacity. We know we will need to bond for this. And bonding is fairly unusual for these kinds of projects in Vermont, not as unusual in Rhode Island. So that's not necessarily a slam dunk for us in Vermont to get the funding we need to build the facility. We think it'll be a minimum of $15 million, could be upwards of 20, even with owning the land. We do have good access to markets here, and both in all domestic in Canada and up and down the East Coast. But for us, the bottom line too is, is this going to be affordable for our community, and what are the pros and cons? And we've had a very good relationship with a third-party operator over the past 20 plus years. And we just need to kind of take a look at the cost of that contract, because we did need to renegotiate that contract several years ago when the markets crashed. And that is a factor. So we need to take a look at that and see if it continues to make sense, or whether we should take those services in-house. Next slide, please. So some of the questions that, again, we're asking ourselves, even though we've been in the business of owning and managing a MRF, is, what is the problem that the city or town needs to solve? What are we looking to do here? Does our community want this? Is Mitch mentioned, is the political will there? We've been very fortunate, both in Rhode Island and in Vermont, to have very supportive boards and very supportive communities. If you're new to this or newer, or just kind of getting back into, what's the timeline that you want to make a change? Because these things take a lot of time. We've been researching our options for a new MRF in Vermont for about 2.5 years. And we think we know what we want, but even so, we're going to engage with a consultant in the next few years, few months, to help us fine tune. And then you have to do a pro forma. You have to, take a look at what the numbers say. And would your municipality be okay just with it being net neutral, or are you going to be expected to turn a profit? So those are just a few of kind of the first step off the first step forward and seeing if you want to try to get back in the game. Next slide, please. That was the end of my presentation, Mary Ann, but I did notice that there were a couple of questions specific to Vermont and Rhode Island. I don't know if you wanted to wait for the end or if you wanted me to address those now.
I would say let's wait till the end.
Okay.
And we'll move on to Rick Watson. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Okay, Mary Ann, can I go now?
Yes, your presentation is in slide mode. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Watson. As introduced before, I'm the CEO of the Delaware Solid Waste Authority. And I've been with the authority for 39 years. And I'm coming from a little bit different angle than our MRF experience at the authority. We've been in the MRF game for 36 years. So we've always been in the game, but in a different private and public partnership scenarios. And that's what my presentation is going to describe. Next slide, please. This is the long version. I'm going to have to skip through some of these slides, Mary Ann. This is just the basic information. Next slide, please. This slide shows the state of Delaware and our facilities. We have a population about 974,000 currently, and we have 3 landfills, 1 in each county, 3 transfer stations, 2 of which are in the lower part of the state that transfer recyclables up to the facility in the northern part of the state labeled a Delaware Recycling Center. That's where our MRFs have been for the 36 years. We have 5 collection stations for rural drop-offs of garbage, and we have 2 dedicated recycling centers and administrative office. Next slide, please. Yeah, this one we show the current last fiscal year information. Our landfill tons were 948,500. Our single stream MRF had 108,300 tons, which actually was down from previous years. We've been as high as 130,000 tons. Construction demolition waste MRF, we have 138,400. And our gate fee is $85 a ton at our landfills and transfer stations. We have contracts for any hauler or individual that wants a discount. And a landfill, the discount is $17 a ton, transfer stations $8.50 a ton. That requires a commitment to bring all of your Delaware waste to the authority. And the recycling fees, when they sign up with the authority, it's $0. And for the operator, which is a private company, Republic now, they set their contracts and charge whatever they can negotiate. Next slide, please. These are the 4 different MRFs that we've had over the years. The first one, Delaware Reclamation Project, started in 1984, ran to 1994. That was followed by the Recycle Delaware Drop-Off Program, 1990 to present. And then we instituted a curbside collection program run by the authority in 2000 and ended in 2011. And then currently our Delaware Recycling Center, 2012 to present. And next slide, please. This slide summarizes the different ownership situations in these different scenarios. The first one, the DRP, the collection was done by haulers. The land and the buildings and the equipment were owned by the authority, and the operations marketing were done by a contractor. When we went to a drop-off program, Recycle Delaware Drop-Off, we had 185 different sites throughout the state on private property. The MRF was on DSWA land and our buildings and our equipment. We operated it and we marketed the materials. And then the curbside program that we ran, we did everything. The collection, came to our processing center, and we operated that and marketed materials. And then we moved on to the current situation where we have our land, our buildings, and the equipment. We now had a contractor came in and installed new equipment, and then also ran it and marketed materials. And if you go to the next slide, please. And this is what set it up. It was Delaware's universal recycling law. We had to have this is a mandatory, quote unquote, requirement. And it requires that the haulers, the solid waste haulers, have to also provide single stream recycling collection to all the residential customers. And it was phased in over time. In 2011, it was all residential, single family residential. And then by 2013, it was a multifamily. And by January of 14, it was all commercial businesses must participate in the recycling program. And single stream by that law required fiber, paper, cardboard, and containers, plastic, glass, and metal. Next slide, please. Our decision not to go all in is based on the all in meant operations. You know, we decided to get out of the operation and into this sort of partnership. Firstly, because haulers didn't have to use a specific facility. When that law came into place, it said you needed to collect recyclables. It left it up to them to decide where to take it. So the large haulers, basically Waste Management and Republic, could choose to take it to their own MRFs. And then in addition, at the time, the largest MRF operator was Community. That's all they did. They ran MRFs. So it could end up at their facility. And another reason was we didn't have experience designing specifically a single stream MRF. Well, we lacked the marketing power compared to large corporations who would have to compete against. And we'd have to be dependent on private MRF operators if for some reason our MRF would be down. And in our legislation, enabling legislation for the authority, we're directed to maximize the use of private industry. It was our initial setup that really encouraged PPP relationships. Next slide, please. This is just the location. Our Delaware Recycling Center is located in Newcastle, and these are the different buildings that we have. And buildings 4 and 5 are the buildings that Community and Republic are using right now for the current MRF that we have. The square footage is about 64,000 square feet total between the two buildings. It's pretty tight. We used what we had. Next slide, please. This is just a timeline for repurposing, and we ended up doing that contract. An RFP was issued. We ended up choosing Community, and between the time you sign, you get to signature, it's a good 6 or 8 months. And then part of it, we also built a LEED certified education building. Like Sarah said, education is a real important part of our system too. Next slide. It kind of just our reasons for choosing Community. And it shows here also that Community invested $15 million to install a BHS system into our existing buildings. Next slide, please. So it ended up with 90 jobs and permanent jobs and 35 tons per hour, and capable of processing 150,000 tons per year. And it serves not only Delaware, but Pennsylvania and Maryland. And that's one of the things, our recycling law did not have a restriction on the recyclables. So as a private entity, Community and now Republic can bring in material recyclables from out of state if they chose to. And of course they do, it helps their economics. Next slide. It consists of 2 processing lines, 2 balers, 5 optical sorters, and like I said, 35 tons per hour single stream. When it opened up in late 2012, 2013, started out with a residue rate of 13%. But unfortunately right now that's closer to 20% because of a lot of reasons, market conditions and just the this total situation. Next slide, please. And we also added an education building as part of it. We had an administrative office that was vacant and was 3,000 square foot. And we hired 2 education coordinators, made a classroom in half of it, and the other half is an exhibit area. Next slide, please. Yeah, this shows our exhibit area. The kiosks were helped to be built by Reed Community, so we did that as a partnership too. Next slide, please. And this is the outside, and this is a LEED certified building to give an example of what could be done. And it wasn't a really outrageous price to do this. Next slide, please. This goes through our situation with Reed Community over the time. So in 2012-15, we constructed it. It began operations and it fulfilled their requirements very well. It started out making money and us sharing in it, but then the market started to decline. So much so that by January of 16, we needed to amend the contract and have a slight increase in their processing charge, but they increased the revenue share portion. And there was a potential that we'd have to have, at some market conditions, give them a subsidy. And this amendment was only for a 5-year term. And then after 5 years, it would revert back to the original requirements. And then from 16 to September of 17, there was even a further decline in the market conditions. And this market subsidy had to be used. And also during that time, Reed Community was suffering financial stress, I'll put it that way. Next slide. So because of that, Republic Services bought out all Reed Community's MRFs in September of 17. And luckily our contract allowed for that. And it was a smooth transition. And Republic were very happy with their performance. But even then, the markets turned severely worse. And it was the worst in December of 19, where we had to subsidize their operation by $221,000 that month. And currently, that'd be, I think, the month of September. It's not as bad, but it's still pretty bad at $120,000 a month. So when it was $221,000 a month, we were like, maybe we need to look at this situation and decide if we want to get into the operation and if that made sense or not. Next slide, please. So we looked at advantages and disadvantages. Our advantages, that we should see some cost savings because we have a lower overhead cost. We're not a private company. We have no profit. And we'd receive the full value instead of sharing the value of the marketed materials. We'd be able to control what materials to add or delete from the recovery process. For example, if we decided we want to go after cartons or polypropylene or flexible pouches, it would be our decision alone. And DSWA could control when and what upgrades to make to any of the equipment if we owned it. And since we're not in the collection business like Republic is, we can provide a more equitable service to all the haulers and be fair in deciding things like contamination, penalties, and incoming material. Next slide, please. Disadvantages. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly how much money could we potentially save, if any even. A lot of that has to do with the market assumptions of what's going to happen in the future. And as you can see, we signed a 20-year contract with Reed Community, and it lasted like 5 years. Things change, and it was, nobody could predict. Haulers, especially the big guys, Waste Management Republic, had the choice. They can take recyclables to other MRFs if they choose. We have less marketing power to sell the materials than the big guys. We have to hire, train, and maintain a qualified staff, which is a pretty big undertaking. We have state personnel laws that could add costs and less flexibility than what the private sector can do. And then there's significant transition issues. The contract as it reads now has conditions for termination when you have force majeure events or if they don't perform, to the standards. And if you don't have any of those conditions, it can be terminated by a written agreement between the two parties. So you need both parties to decide, oh, it makes sense for us to get out of the contract and do something new. Well, if you go in that situation, the equipment's owned by Republic, we'd have to come to an agreement about if we're going to purchase that equipment, that it can be purchased at a reasonable price. And is the equipment in good condition or not? You have to determine that too. And then if that's not desirable, geez, we could, as the owner of the building, say, we'd like you to remove your equipment from our building. And then we'd have to start from scratch with getting new equipment. And then timing to do all of that would be critical. It doesn't happen overnight, be many months. And then during those many months, what happens to the recyclables that are collected? In addition, we'd have to be able to fund if the transition required a purchase of the equipment and any capital improvements in the future years. So overall, the risk is greater with the option two, of course, depending on the markets and other factors about are the markets going to get better maybe? And gee, if they did get better, maybe we shouldn't have gone this route anyway. Next slide, please. So we concluded that the disadvantages outweighed the advantages. And we're currently renegotiating our existing contract costs and risk structure. And it's key there that we try to get to be a little bit more transparent than we currently are. We're doing fairly good as far as Republic is fairly open about what they do, how they market. And then we want to renegotiate an equitable control of contamination issues. And again, what that means is that Republic also collects and brings Republic's customers recyclables to their facility. And the way that they rate their own contamination versus their competitors coming into this facility is a concern. So we're going to have some sort of a third-party inspection to deal with contamination, and we're working with Republic to come up with something that's equitable for everyone. Our desire is to have a level playing field for everyone and all of our customers. Next slide, please. That's my presentation, and there's the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. I'd like to Sarah to come back and to our three speakers to take themselves off mute so we could get started with our Q&A. The first question is there a size scale at which it starts to make financial sense to run a municipal MRF? Who'd like to start on this one? Sarah?
Sure. I can say for us, we determined that back when we built the MRF in 1993, we knew we had a volume of about 25,000 tons. So much below that, it didn't make sense. We also had to take into consideration, though, the distance that we would need to transport the recyclables to the next nearest MRF. So for us and for our materials, that meant transporting at least 60 to 65 miles away. So you want to factor that in as well. So it may be that if you have a smaller amount of material, but you still have a good mix of material that you can find markets for locally, transporting it, another 40, 50, 60 miles plus could be that tipping factor for you. In Rhode Island, it was really never a question because we knew we had the density of population and we knew we had the mandatory recycling law, pretty early on. So we knew there would be a steady flow, being right on excellent interstate access. We had access to rail, we had access to shipping lanes if we needed to. It was never a question that we wouldn't. So we had started off there with about 45,000 tons. And now they're well over 100,000 tons that process at that facility in Rhode Island. So that becomes more of a factor of, I think they're looking to process if they're not already on a second shift. So that, that's another thing you need to take a look at as well. But for us, building this new MRF, we are looking at between 30 and 35,000 as our bottom point.
Marion, the only thing I'd add to it, this is Mitch, is that, I break them into categories, just for simplicity, small, medium, and large. And, there are all kinds of facilities out there, but once you get much less than 6 tons per hour, I'm going to talk per hour because that's how the equipment's usually looked at. 6 to 10 tons, I would say, is a small category. And, there's always economic challenges. If there's less tons, the more cost per ton it tends to be. And I would say that medium category in the norm now is about 25 tons an hour, and that comes out to about 50,000 tons. And then you get into the large facilities, which are 50 tons an hour, which are usually dual lines and robotics. And then you're in that 100,000 tons. So Sarah, you're right on. It depends where you are, what you're trying to do. There's MRF technology out there to do less than 10 tons per hour. So there's almost not one size fits all, because there's 3 different sizes I talked about, but different sizes for different opportunities.
Well, I think there's a good follow-up to this. A good follow-up question is, can anybody speak to the mini MRFs? And in particular, the one being offered by Revolution Systems. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I'm from Revolution Systems and I'm online. I don't know if that helps. We are a small format MRF. We range, in community size. We can service between 20,000 people and 100,000 people. We have a base model that we scale up to hit the higher sizes. And our goal is to get the material into a baled truckload format as fast as possible so that the material transportation and handling can be minimized. Put another way, we target transfer stations. If you have to go through a transfer station and you have to transport it a good distance to get to the transfer station, and then from the transfer station on to a larger MRF, our smaller format MRFs usually make sense. And it kind of goes back to what Mitch said earlier in terms of understanding cost. There's a big problem in the industry, I think, right now relative to understanding cost, because the pressure that pricing has put on the market is so intense that those boundaries and that lack of transparency really doesn't work anymore, because it's really all about total system cost. It's not about the cost to the community versus the cost to the operator versus the cost to the market. It's about the total system cost to get the material to market in place, mill ready to go. And that means squeezing out all types of handling, transportation of residue and things like that. And a smaller format, decentralized system tends to facilitate that.
Thank you, Pat. Pat, if there's any other information you want to share, I would ask you to do so through the chat box. Thank you.
Will do. Thanks.
Okay. Getting to our next question. All of you have talked about marketing, but the question has come up again. Is it necessary for the community to be marketing their own materials? Or is that something you can hand off to somebody else to do? I mean, it still is an area of concern. So Rick, how about you start this time?
There's always brokers. Anybody can use brokers, the big guys and the little guys. Simple answer.
Okay. Anybody want to add to that?
Yep, Marion, I think Rick is dead on. I mean, there not only are brokers, there are integrated waste companies who take material. There are brokers who take material. There are end mills who take it. There are local processors. So I don't think any government should feel they have to market the material. There are municipalities out there that do market material quite successfully all over for various reasons. So I think that fits in that depends category, but no municipality should feel they have to market their own material unless it's a very small, urban, rural area that no one's going to really want to pay attention to. But I know in Vermont, there are plenty of, in New Hampshire, Maine, plenty of small areas that do market themselves.
Okay. And I'm just going through the questions here. Rick, what is the recycling rate in Delaware?
Depends on how you define recycling. But we do an annual report, and for the entire state, not just what we do, but commercial too. And it's 39% the way that we count. And we use the EPA definition basically to be consistent. And that's where we are.
Thank you. Mitch, you observed that the private sector was quick to implement higher processing fees on municipalities when China implemented restrictions on recyclable materials. Are municipally owned MRFs better positioned to absorb additional costs when there are significant market changes?
As a general statement, I would say I think so, because a government who runs the MRF has other budget areas they could turn to and other adjustments they could make to balance that out short term. Where I'm in the private sector, and I look at my profit, and other businesses look at their profit quarterly and annually, and they need to move quicker. I'm sure some of my colleagues from various companies on here would say they weren't able to move quick enough because they were locked into some contracts. But yeah, I think the government has other means that the private sector cannot do once they're in a contract to adjust. So I think it does give flexibility. If you would ask the people at the Solid Waste Authority in Palm Beach, who've been doing it for 30 years, if you would ask others that were on that list and other people on this call, I think they would say they had the ability to adjust. I think we run out of room though. And what I mean by that is time, as it's now costing more in many jurisdictions on a per ton basis to recycle than to dispose of material. I think we're getting towards the end of that road.
Well, we in Delaware, the law is interesting. Universal recycling law required that the haulers, and this is part of what they agreed to, charge each household a single fee that covered both recycling and solid waste. And it doesn't break it out how much for each. It's just one fee.
Vermont is the same in our universal recycling law as well, one fee.
I'm not sure who this should go to, so you can decide. When calculating the average value of your products per ton, is it standard practice to include the cost of residues disposal?
I'm going to start. I put that chart up, and I'll let Rick and Sarah add to it. I would start by saying there is no standard practice, and there's a problem. It's done differently, just as Sarah and Rick just defined the laws in their state. It's done differently by different places. So I don't think there's a standard practice. I think it requires knowledge of all participants to say, how are we handling contamination and residue disposal? Are we putting a value in that or not? Because that's going to change that number. That's why I was saying earlier, it's understanding what works in your jurisdiction. We could change these numbers to come out. I can make them $30 a ton average market value and 90 with a few little adjustments to what we're assuming.
Yeah, in our situation, it's established by the contract. The contract includes contamination, or the residue, I mean, disposal as part of that overall number.
And in Vermont, the residue disposal is managed by the operator, and that is part of their processing fee. So they wrap in the cost of disposal of that. So the average commodity value is just for the materials that are actually sent to market.
Yeah, it's a little different.
Yeah.
That was great. I mean, you two were great. You gave two exactly what I'm getting at, two different examples. Numbers aren't consistent across the United States because you have different ways you're doing it, which totally works for both of you. So to answer the person who asked that question, in one case, the residue number is in the processing fee. In another case, it's not. So it's where is the money, and understanding that that's really critical for clarity here.
And this one is for Rick. What's the different standard for contamination that Republic uses for material that they deliver compared to the standard for material delivered by other haulers?
Well, theoretically, it's the same standard. what's different is that there's a charge, right? And you're charging as Republic, it's Republic charging itself. That's the difference.
Okay. And Sarah, you mentioned using rail for transporting materials. What kind of success have you had with utilizing rail compared to trucks?
We've had zero success. So we don't have a spur near us in Vermont. There was the potential in Rhode Island for extending a spur to resource recovery. And if that had happened, then it's a whole different ballgame. But we just don't have that access in Vermont. And we have actually better access to rail in Vermont, but we don't have the access to the markets. So the access from the markets by rail in Rhode Island was better than it is here. So rail would be great if we would absolutely love to use it. It's limited.
Did Rick or Mitch, did you want to add to that one?
I'm good.
We don't have rail available.
All right.
Mary, while you're looking for the next one, I would just say that it's a variable. Back to that list. I think that's what Rick was just saying, but it's one of the variables. If you have a rail spur, it's going to impact how you could look at marketing the material.
That's right.
How are you managing contamination?
So in the Vermont MRF and the one that we manage now, we have a very, very low contamination rate. It's single stream MRF, but our rate is about 8%, which is highly unusual. And in Rhode Island, it was upwards of 25 to 26% when it was single stream. Dual stream was significantly less. So for us in Vermont, we did do an anti-contamination campaign last year, and we chose to focus really on 4 items, things that everyone I think is knowledgeable about, things that wrap, whether it's cables, chains, bags, rinsing your containers out, very simple messages to help kind of cut down on that, but our rate is pretty low, very low.
Could I ask Rick and Sarah to talk about how easy or hard it is to remove items from your list of acceptable recyclables?
Once it's on, it's hard to take off. And really think the opportunity to, if you wanted to take another look at the materials that you accept, is if you are going to either build a new facility or start a new program, particularly, or adding new equipment. If you have an older MRF and you're looking to add new equipment, that's your opportunity to say, here's why we can no longer take X. We want to protect this investment, or this particular set of equipment is only able to sort out these kinds of materials. But once you put something on it, you've got to have a really good reason to take it off, because the public gets used to that.
Yeah, same thing here. But there is also another consideration in our state. Since I pointed out the universal law had specific requirements. So for instance, glass by law is required to be brought to us. So we can't simply say, we're not making any money on glass. In fact, it's a big negative. We want to take it out. We'd have to change the law if we wanted to do that. And that's not going to happen.
And in Vermont, we don't have the requirement that the materials be brought to our facility, but people are required, everyone, businesses as well, from keeping certain materials out of the landfill. Doesn't necessarily have to come to us, but they can't put it in their trash. So again, a little slight difference.
So I'd like to ask each one of you, if you had a magic ball and could foresee what you think the perfect MRF would be, how would you describe it?
My first word would be flexible, and to be able to change with the materials as they're changing. That's a real problem that we're all experiencing now is just particularly with packaging and how it's just changed dramatically over the past 10 to 15 years. And so being able to more quickly accommodate materials as they're coming online and coming through our system, and where they have a matching market to be able to sort that material. And I mean, the technology is there. So it's just being able to be flexible with your inbound and then your outbound, and having that market to be able to say, sure, we can add that material because we have a market for it. I mean, you can sort it almost anything, but it's getting it to someone who's going to buy it on the other end. And that's, I think, where a lot of frustration comes for the public is, well, why are you telling me all plastics aren't the same? Well, 'cause I don't have a buyer for all plastics. So for us, it's flexibility.
I would add to that. I agree. I would add to that to go upstream to the brands and the design for recyclability to begin with, so we wouldn't have to make so many changes in the MRFs to follow and react. We need to work together better in the future, MRFs and the brands, to design for recyclability.
I think that on point, and just as an old school guy, I'd throw in one technology, which is not something I would have, technology keeps evolving in this. And as the price of optics and robots hopefully continues to decrease and supply and demand balances that out, the issue right now is a smaller facility can't really afford. When I say smaller, I'm at 6 to 10 ton per hour. It's tough to put too many optics and robots in a facility like that. But there's a facility in Florida, which some of you may have visited, that has 14 robots in it. And I think one of the trends, besides what Rick and Sarah have pointed out, is that technology advancement, because I'm with you, Rick, that's ideal on the brands and, some producer responsibility, but I think more and more it's that adaptability to be able to set the optic and set a robot to pick different types of material, be it paper, plastic, et cetera. So I think technology is going to continue to play a big role in this. And the people who are highly automated and who have challenges getting enough labor to work in one of these plants, I think are going in that direction of how to reduce labor costs. The robots tend to not call in sick. They might break, but they could be fixed.
But then if MRFs are getting better at separating out individual things, we'll get to a point where, you can separate out maybe 50 different things. And then you'll have okay, I need to accumulate 7 or 8 bales of those things. This is going to take me a year. What do I do with my bale storage?
That's why you have to build your MRF bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So that's where the land comes into effect. It's not just having a facility sized properly or well enough for the equipment. You've got to have bale storage. And in the Northeast, you really need to have bale storage for, just the weather, the bad weather and the transportation. We haven't really talked too much about trucking, but that's an issue across the country. No one is immune from those pressures and getting materials to market. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Rick. It can take a year to accumulate one truckload.
Mitch, you had a tale of two cities.
Mm-hmm.
Did Kessler Consulting conduct all of those studies?
The two that I used here as examples, yes, it's readily available data to me that in one case is literally 2 weeks old and the other case is 2 months old from the source of the sort. So yes, those were recycling composition studies that we conducted, yes, for public clients.
And they are available publicly?
They are available. If someone's interested, they could reach out to us and we hook them up with where to get them. Okay. Which they could get them from. It is public information.
Okay. Let's see. I guess we haven't talked about safety at all, and I just wondered how safety fits into your both your partnership that you have with the companies that you're working with at the MRF, or how do you incorporate that in your agreement with whoever you're working with?
Yeah, for us, it's just part of the contract. And I know in Rhode Island, we required our contractor to provide us with their safety manual, their updated version of their safety manual every year. We conducted safety trainings with them, and they had to have a certified safety. We had a certified safety officer. They had to have a certified safety officer. And then we would bring in OSHA and just do voluntary inspections. Here in Vermont, similarly, it is part of the contract, and it's an expectation that they have proper insurance and they have proper training. You just got to be very careful to make sure that it's specified.
Yeah, and our situation's similar. It's contractually dealt with, and we have to make sure that they're following what they say they're going to do. And but in addition to that, one item is lithium batteries, and it's been a problem over the years, and it's going to get worse probably. And to address that, education to our customers to make sure they don't put anything like that in their recyclables to begin with. So on our education part, we emphasize that. And then we have a program, our electronic goods and battery recycling program, to collect those, give a place for those to go. If they say, don't put it in recycling, don't put it in garbage, here's the place that you can take those. So that's very important.
Marion, I would say your safety question is critically important, and I agree with Rick and Sarah. The place that's more of a challenge is when if the public sector decides to get in that business and operate a facility, there's extensive training necessary. The people who are in the processing business, the mills, the integrated solid waste companies have extensive operations and experience and have safety people usually on board to lay those programs out. If a government's getting into it, they have to make sure that they have an experienced MRF operator and then attend trainings that are out there in our industry. Because Rick and Sarah both basically said, hey, it's in our contract. Well, it's not in your contract if you're operating your own. That requires some knowledge and gaining that safety, which is critically important to our industry.
Absolutely, and that is why Resource Recovery made the investment in their own employee as a health and safety officer.
Bingo, right.
I've gone through all of our questions. Do you have any last thoughts?
I think the basic thing is you've heard there's no one thing that fits all situations. It depends on a lot of things. It depends.
Sarah,
I'm
Sarah?
just tackling because it's I hate that answer, but it depends. But I know it's right, and I'm more than happy if anyone has questions or anything, if they want to email me, and I know Rick is open as well, and probably Rick and Mitch too. But there really are so many factors, and it does take time to really sort through whether or not it's going to make some sense for you. And it's a matrix. You can put all the factors along the different axes, and you got to kind of plug away at them, and then you got to sell it to your community. You got to sell it to your politicians. It's not a yes or a no. It really is so many different things to go into it. But we've found that for us anyway, it makes sense for us. We are so used to it. We think we do a good job. It's part of our mission. And we like having that public option for not just relying on the private sector. It does give a little bit of competition and some tension to keep prices reasonable. It also we like providing a basic level of service. And with in Vermont, we think it's important to be able to help people to achieve the state's mandates. And one of the ways that our district has done that is to provide this facility to ensure that people can comply.
I guess the one I would add to just throw out there, and you guys are dead on point, 2020 has been a hard year for a lot of people. And I mean that in our industry in particular, we had the virus. Not only did that impact the health and well-being of people collecting on trucks, people working in MRFs, but we had a shift in the garbage and recycling business, many more people at home, certain businesses closing. So we had the virus to deal with. The markets continue to be down overall. They did not jump back up the way some people hoped. And the cost of labor, insurance, and the equipment has gone up. So that's 2020. So I guess my hope for 2021 is the markets get better, the virus gets better, and that we figure out two things. One is a way to communicate more transparently with clearer definitions. So we're all talking about the same thing, because it came up on this call a number of times. Well, what is the contamination number? Well, these things just need clearer, I would hope, national and state definitions. And the last one I'd hope for is that, besides, that better communication, and open and honest communication, is states start to go back to setting some policies that match the 21st century that we're in. Some of the things Rick was referring to, and you mentioned, Sarah, they're somewhat dated. And I'm not picking on the states. Anywhere in the country you can go. Florida, is beyond dated. We need some state policy that helps drive and deal with the issue of how to process in a cost-effective way, and how to help local government not be spending so much more money on recycling than disposal, and help the industry make a profit so they can continue to provide quality service. That's my hope for 2021.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of our speakers from today and sharing all of your knowledge. As Sarah had mentioned, and also Rick and Mitch have provided their email addresses in their presentations. I'll also be including them in the email that I send to you tomorrow to alert you to the posting of the webinar recording and the presentations, so that if you want to talk with them further or about specific things that came to mind after this afternoon, you have the ability to do so. I think that it became quite clear is that people just need to talk to each other to find out what each other are thinking about this, because it was obvious that there is no one right answer, and that there could be a combination of details that work for one community that doesn't for another. So understanding what they are is key. But I thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and we'll get these the presentations and the recording up by tomorrow.
Thank you, Mary Ann.
Bye-bye.